Masks crafted from human faces, chairs draped in flesh, belts stitched from women's nipples, bowls carved out of skulls, and a refrigerator filled with human organs. Who was the man that inspired Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs, Hitchcock's Psycho, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Let's find out. On November 16, 1957, 58-year-old Bernice Warden, the hardware store owner in Plainfield, disappeared without a trace. At the scene, police discovered bloodstains and noticed that the cash register had also been emptied. Receipts showed that the last customer that day had been a local man named Ed Gein, and several witnesses reported seeing him lurking around the store. That was enough for investigators to head to his crumbling farmhouse, where they came across far more than they could have ever imagined. As the officers stepped inside, the combination of what they saw and smelled was unbearable. The house was filled with garbage and rotting waste. Piles of trash and random objects cluttered the floors and tables, so much that it was difficult to move through the rooms, and the odor was suffocating. During the search, Sheriff Arthur Schley shone his flashlights inside the shed when something brushed against his coat. Looking up, he found himself staring up at a body hanging upside down from the rafters. The corpse had been decapitated, split open from the pelvis to the neck with all internal organs removed. The genitals were found in a box, the heart stuffed into a plastic bag. The victim was soon identified as Bernice Warden, the store owner and mother of Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden. Horrified by the discovery, Sheriff Schley had to step outside, where he immediately threw up. The deeper the police searched the house, the more unimaginable objects they uncovered. 10 female heads with the tops sawn off, as Gein had been using the skulls as bowls. 9 masks made from human faces mounted on the walls as decorations. Chair seats covered in human skin, lampshades made of women's faces, and bedposts topped with skulls. Lips strung together and tied to a window shade. Investigators also found a shoebox containing 9 vulvas, 4 noses, bones and bone fragments, organs stored in the refrigerator, a heart left on the stove, a belt crafted from nipples, and 2 severed heads, Bernice Warden's and Mary Hogan's. At that point, the officers could only wonder just how many women had fallen victim to Ed Gein. Now let's take a look at little Eddie, the boy who grew into a man who skinned women, preserved heads, and even supposedly snagged on a human heart. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27th, 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He was the second son of Augusta and George Gein. His brother Henry was 7 years older. Their father was an alcoholic who barely played any role in the family. He was quiet, withdrawn, and mostly absent when it came to raising the boys, so most of the responsibility ended up falling on the mother. Augusta was fanatically religious, determined to raise her boys under her own strict moral code. She was always quoting the Bible, preaching about sin and damnation, and constantly condemning women. In her eyes, every woman, except for herself, was immoral and, well, practically a whore. She drilled into her sons endless sermons about lust and desire, warning them over and over about the fires of hell. Even sex within marriage she called disgusting and horrendous, though she accepted it as a necessary evil for having children. Her goal was to make sure Ed and Henry never gave in to sinful urges, and that the fear of hellfire would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And it certainly did. But Ed's natural attraction to girls clashed hard with his mother's constant threats of eternal punishment. Shy and withdrawn by nature, Ed never dated and never formed a healthy relationship with women. Instead, he grew unnaturally, almost obsessively attached to his mother. She urged him to stay a virgin, framing it as a proof of his loyalty. And in doing so, she took complete control over his sexuality, leaving him drowning in shame. Looking at the case, criminal psychologists believe it's highly likely that Augusta sexually abused his sons, especially the youngest. It seems that sexual traumas and hang-ups from her own childhood drove her to try teaching Ed about sex in this twisted way. This gave her intense sexual control over him, leaving the boy with a deep sense of shame whenever he masturbated because he couldn't think of any other woman, only his mother, which only made his trauma even worse. There was one moment on the farm he could never forget. As a kid, he once watched his mother slaughter a pig, and when she gutted the animal, Ed was sexually aroused by what he just witnessed. It was confusing and disturbing for him, but it planted its seeds deep inside him, twisting together violence, sex, and shame. Psychologists have pointed out that shame is much deeper and more painful than guilt. Guilt is a simple fact: either you did something wrong or you didn't. Shame, on the other hand, is this deep, gnawing feeling that eats away at you from the inside. For Ed, as a kid, it probably felt like someone was constantly pouring acid on his soul. At least that's what the experts, far wiser than me, would say. Augusta did everything she could to keep her sons cut off from the outside world. Back in La Crosse, she ran a small grocery store, and with the business bringing in steady money, the family eventually saved up enough to move. When Ed was about 8, they bought a remote farm in Plainfield, far away from the sinful city and its sinful people. The house was huge, surrounded by 195 acres of land, with the nearest neighbor living almost a mile away. Even though the family was practically isolated and barely interacted with anyone, the boys still had to go to school. Little Ed wasn't exactly popular there. His classmates thought he was odd and too feminine, and often bullied and excluded him. To make things worse, his mother scolded him regularly whenever he tried to make friends. Ed spent most of his free time reading. He loved adventure novels and magazines, which gave him an escape from the dull routine of everyday life. In 1940, their father died of a heart attack, and from then on, the boys kept the farm going and supported their mother by taking on different odd jobs around the village. Boys, well, by then they were practically grown men in their mid-30s. Ed idolized his older brother Henry and always looked up to him, but tension began to build between them. To Ed, their mother was the very embodiment of goodness, someone he obeyed without question. Henry, on the other hand, didn't share that view. He worried more and more about Ed's unhealthy attachment to their mother and often criticized Augusta openly, something Ed considered nothing sort of a blasphemy. By the early 1940s, Henry had met a woman and started a serious relationship, clearly trying to break free from his mother's suffocating influence and live a life of his own. This growing independence only deepened the divide between him and Augusta's teachings, and maybe those tensions played a role in Henry's mysterious death in 1944. On May 16, the two brothers were trying to put out a fire near the farm. In the thick smoke and darkness, they lost sight of each other. After the fire was extinguished, Eddie reportedly called the police in a panic, saying he couldn't find Henry. By the time the search team arrived, Eddie had already led them straight to the body. Henry's corpse was lying on untouched ground, so the fire hadn't reached him, but he clearly had head injuries. And yet, despite the suspicious circumstances, the police ruled out foul play. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. After that, Ed was left with only his mother, finally. But then, not long after, on December 29th, the following year, he lost her too after she suffered multiple strokes. At that point, his life completely fell apart. As Harold Schechter writes in Deviant, he lost his only friend, his only true love. He was completely alone in the world. For him, she was the one who loaded him with trauma around sex and sexuality, raising him in fear and terror, shaking him to his core emotionally and affecting practically every part of his life. He clung to his mother with an almost obsessive intensity. After all, she had complete control over his life, and even after her death, he still feared her. No matter that she was buried, he felt as if she was still pulling the strings from the grave. He sensed this strange, almost supernatural power within himself and became obsessed with the idea of bringing his mother back to life. Every evening, he would go to her grave, praying and performing peculiar rituals in the hope of resurrecting her. When his mission failed, though sources differ and the accounts are far from clear, many claim that just a few weeks after her death, he dug up her grave, brought her corpse back to the house, and decapitated her. On the other hand, several accounts suggest this never actually happened, possibly because the coffin had been encased with concrete, keeping him from reaching it, or perhaps because he was so terrified of his mother, even after her death, that he simply didn't dare disturb her body. In any case, Ed stayed on the farm and supported himself with odd jobs. Among them, he was a babysitter. Fun, fun, fun. He actually got along better with kids than he ever did with people his own age. Given his childhood, it's no wonder his social and emotional development fell well behind. Inside the house, he left the rooms his mother had once occupied completely untouched, just as they were before she died. He locked them up and preserved them almost like a shrine. As for himself, he lived in the kitchen in a small room, buried in filth. And he grew lonelier and lonelier. He spent most of his free time reading adventure novels and anatomy books. Alongside piles of garbage, his rooms were stacked with magazines about Nazis, South Seas headhunters, and shipwrecks. From these stories, he picked up handy little skills like how to shrink heads, dig up graves, and dissect a body. These bizarre tales fascinated him, and he even shared them with local kids he occasionally looked after. Some researchers suggest Gein may have drawn inspiration from those Nazi magazines, which detailed how concentration camp victims' bodies were used for experiments or turned into everyday objects, lampshades, book covers, things like that, all made from human skin. These stories might have normalized or even reinforced his own twisted fantasies when he was at home creating. On top of that, he regularly read the local newspapers. His favorite section was the obituaries, a very useful hobby since these told him when a woman in the area had recently passed away. And with no real relationships with the opposite sex, he satisfied his morbid urges by making late-night trips to the cemetery. And although he claimed he had never had sex with the corpses, because in his words, they smelled too bad, later psychological evaluation made it almost certain that he did, not just with his mother's body, but with others as well. And there were also signs of cannibalism. What he did admit to, however, was that he took a great pleasure in skinning the bodies and wearing their flesh. He made masks from their faces, which he would pull over his own, and even crafted full skin suits and garments from their skin, corsets, leggings like pants, women's dresses, and more. This is a clear example of what Freud first called the Madonna-whore complex, the idea that a man divides women into two extreme categories. On one side are the pure, almost sacred mother figures he admires but can't feel desire for, sexual desire. On the other side are the sinful women he desires but he can never actually respect. Skinning corpses and wearing their flesh may have been Ed's twisted way of fulfilling the fantasy of becoming his own mother. Gein was deeply attached to his mother, but he also hated her. After all, she had inflicted the greatest traumas of his life, similar in fact to what we see in Ed Kemper's case. He was also curious what it felt like to be a woman with breasts and a vagina, and often daydreamed about living life as one. He was obsessively fascinated by women's power and control they held over men. Over the years, he dug up so many graves that he built up an entire collection of human remains, even shrunken and preserved heads. On one occasion, a boy he often babysat visited the farm and later recalled that Ed had shown him the heads he kept in his bedroom. Ed casually explained that they were trophies from South Sea headhunters. Originally made by Amazonian tribes like in Ecuador and Peru for ritual purposes, the human heads were carefully preserved, the skull removed, and the skin and hair shrunk through various boiling, smoking, and drying techniques, leaving a tiny mummified head. While the tribes used them for religious reasons, Ed Gein collected them purely as trophies to feel closer to his mother in his own twisted fantasy world. Although the little boy told others what he had seen on the farm, nobody believed him. They thought he had just made it up. Later, 2 more local kids visited the farm and saw the preserved female heads as well, but they assumed they were just strange Halloween costumes. That's when the rumors started in the village, and soon everyone was whispering around the weird things Eddie might be hiding in his house. Locals would joke about his shrunken heads, and he either nodded with a smile or simply said, "Oh, they're in my room." Still, nobody took the story seriously, that is, until Bernice Warden disappeared. By the late 1940s and into the 50s, Wisconsin was experiencing a growing number of disappearances, and the police were getting increasingly on edge. 4 cases in particular left them puzzled. The first happened on May 1st, 1947. An 8-year-old girl, Georgia Weckler, vanished while walking home from school. Hundreds of local residents and officers scoured the area, but the girl never turned up. The only clue was a tire track from a Ford found nearby. In November 1952, 2 men, Victor Travis and Ray Burgess, went missing while hunting around Plainfield. They were last seen at a local bar and then nothing. Neither the men nor their car were ever found. A year later in La Crosse, a 15-year-old girl named Evelyn Hartley disappeared while babysitting. His father, unable to reach her by phone, went to the house in person. The door was locked, but through a window he spotted her shoes and glasses lying on the floor. He could only get into the house through the back window leading to the basement, and that's when he found blood. Signs of a struggle were everywhere. Blood splatters, a single shoe in the basement, bloody handprints on the neighbor's wall, and blood tracks in the grass leading away from the house. Later, Ellen's bloodied clothing was also discovered along a nearby road, but they never found her. Then, in the winter of 1954, Mary Hogan, a Plainfield barmaid, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Bloodstains and a bullet casing were found at the scene, but she was never recovered. Finally, on November 17, 1957, after police discovered Bernice Warden's decapitated body and Gein's trophies in the house, they launched a full-scale search on the farm and surrounding lands. Investigators suspected that the Plainfield men might be responsible for several other disappearances, including the ones that I just mentioned. While the police continued searching and digging around the farm, Ed was sitting in the Wautoma County Jail for questioning. At first, he denied killing anyone and insisted he was innocent. After officers had finished a house search that lasted over 6 hours, Sheriff Schley was reportedly so shaken by the horrors he'd seen that back at the station he physically attacked Ed in his cell. Some accounts claim that he was smashing his head into the wall, and he even choked Gein. About a day later, he confessed to killing Bernice Worden and admitted that most of the human remains found in his house that had come from nearby cemeteries. He claimed that he couldn't remember every detail because he had been in a dazed state at the time of the murder. According to his story, he had dragged Bernice to his Ford truck and even taken the cash register from her store. However, he insisted he didn't remember shooting her in the head, though the autopsy clearly proved that he did. This is a classic case of malingered amnesia, which is very common in criminal defenses. It usually happens for one of two reasons. Either the perpetrator believes it's legally advantageous to claim they don't remember what happened, or genuinely they don't want to recall or recount in detail the horrific acts they committed. Later, under pressure from the police, he also confessed to killing Mary Hogan, though again he presented it as if he couldn't remember the details, just that he accidentally shot her. He explained the murders by saying that it was easier to work with fresher skin, unlike the bodies that had been dead for weeks. During interrogations, Ed showed absolutely no emotion. He spoke calmly, even cheerfully at times about what he had done, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to cut out deceased women's nipples and turn them into belts, or to eat baked beans from human skulls. Meanwhile, the authorities continued searching the farm, where they found the remains of 10 women. Gein insisted that he had dug up 8 of them from cemeteries, though the police weren't entirely sure. When they opened the cemetery graves, they found disturbed coffins and bodies that were partially or entirely missing, which supported his claims, but didn't rule out the possibility of other murders. It's worth noting that Ed passed every polygraph test, yet his mental state often distorted his perception of reality, which made the investigation much more difficult. Although his name came up in connection with several other missing persons cases, the police, lacking evidence, officially charged him with only 2 murders, Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, both of whom eerily resembled his deceased mother. Ed's mental state quickly became a question during the interviews. His lawyer suggested he plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Psychiatric evaluations confirmed that he was indeed mentally disturbed, with experts diagnosing schizophrenia and sexual psychopathy. They tracked his back to his pathological relationship with his mother and the way he was raised. He was both attracted to and terrified of women, the duality only twisted further by his mother's religious fanaticism, and this conflict eventually escalated into full-blown psychosis. Psychiatrists and criminal psychologists agree that the root of Gein's actions lay in his deeply ingrained mother complex, his sexual confusion, and extreme social isolation. Rarely, if ever, do we see a serial killer raised in a healthy, stable family, and while little is known about his mother beyond her extreme control issues, criminal psychologist Dr. Eric Hickey believes that Ed Gein's mother likely endured severe suffering in her own childhood, wounds that she inadvertently passed on to her son. Given the circumstances of his upbringing, Ed had virtually no opportunity to develop normal social skills. Nothing in his environment encouraged healthy development or socialization, leaving him ill-equipped to function in society, basically. During the psychological evaluation, Gein was deemed unfit to stand trial and was sent to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, meaning he couldn't be brought to court for first-degree murder. Locals were understandably outraged that he wouldn't face punishment for the deaths of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, feeling that justice had not been served. Perhaps that public anger led to the events of March 20th, 1958, when in the early hours of the morning, someone set fire to the serial killer's house. It burned to the ground almost instantly, and the neighbors watched with what seemed like relief as the house of horrors was destroyed. Police confirmed arson had occurred, but the perpetrator was never found. Although the fire destroyed a lot, many items survived and were auctioned off, including the infamous 49 Ford he used to transport bodies, which sold for $760. On January 22nd, 1968, after 10 years of institutionalization, doctors deemed Gein's mental state sufficiently stable to face trial. New hearings began in Wisconsin regarding Bernice Worden's murder. The defense maintained the not guilty by reason of insanity strategy, claiming that at the time of the murders he had been psychotic and unable to understand the consequences of his actions. During the trial, 7 witnesses testified, including forensic experts confirming the circumstances of Worden's death and sheriff's deputies describing the evidence found in his house. And evidence clearly established that he had committed the murder. 10 months later, on November 7th, the verdict was delivered. Gein was guilty of killing Bernice Worden, but since expert testimony confirmed he had been legally insane at the time, the outcome was essentially the same as before, not guilty by reason of insanity. He was sent back to the Central State Hospital and later transferred to the Mendota Psychiatric Institute, where he spent the remainder of his life. Dr. Louis Lazinger, a criminal psychologist specializing in necrophilia, explains that such a verdict legally requires impaired judgment, typically involving delusional thinking, like believing God told me to do it or aliens are controlling my brain. Ed Gein, however, knew exactly what he was doing. He was fully aware of his actions. The expert states, looking at it from a broader perspective, I see no reason to call him legally insane. Seriously disturbed? Yes. Illegally insane? On what basis? He knew what he was doing and that it was wrong. That's the legal standard. It's important to note, however, that in the 1950s, psychiatry and the legal system drew far less distinction between mental illness and legal responsibility. If someone did something incomprehensible, violently extreme, or bizarre, public opinion and often the authorities as well would simply label them crazy and insane. Today, of course, things are examined much more thoroughly, or at least I would hope. Gein's time in the psychiatric hospital was reportedly peaceful. Records describe him as happier than ever. He got along with the others, though he was mostly a solitary soul. He ate regularly, gained a lot of weight, read constantly, enjoyed talking with the psychologists, and loved crafts, stone polishing, weaving rugs, that sort of thing. Overall, a kind, gentle patient, aside from staring at the female staff, but at least he never needed tranquilizers. The head of the institute reportedly said, if all our patients were like him, we wouldn't have a problem. On July 26, 1984, after a long battle with cancer, Ed Gein died. He was buried in the Plainfield cemetery beside his mother, not far from the graves of the people whose body parts he had used to decorate his living room. Quite absurd, really. His tombstone was repeatedly vandalized. People took pieces of it as souvenirs. Eventually, authorities removed it for safety reasons and stored what remained in a warehouse. Ed Gein's story had a massive impact on film and pop culture, inspiring an entire line of iconic horror characters. Robert Bloch, for instance, was directly inspired by Gein when he created Norman Bates just 2 years after Gein's arrest, the character who would become iconic in Hitchcock's classic thriller Psycho. That film changed the thriller genre forever. It broke conventional storytelling rules, blending psychological tension with horror, and pushed boundaries on previously taboo subjects like violence and sexuality. It also opened the door for the portrayal of mentally disturbed killers, shaping countless thrillers that followed. Additionally, the 1974 film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre drew heavily from Gein's story, and later he inspired Buffalo Bill as well in The Silence of the Lambs, another serial killer who collected female skin and wore it as part of a deranged ritual. Local children, meanwhile, sang morbid songs and invented jokes about Ed Gein, using dark humor to process the horrific incidents. Harold Schechter writes in Deviant that this was their way of chasing the nightmare away with laughter. These sick jokes became known as Geiners and quickly spread worldwide. That pretty much wraps up my series on serial killers. Thank you for making it this far and watching this episode. This is actually the first narrated video I've ever done, so there may be more to come, or may not. Bye!